Before we begin, a quick warning. Tennessee True Crime contains detailed descriptions and images of real-life violence. Some listeners and viewers may find the material deeply disturbing. This content is intended for mature audiences only. And remember, the goal of sharing these stories is not to sensationalize tragedy, but to honor the victims, understand the truth, and give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. This episode deals with sexual violence, murder, and some really disturbing behavior. It's one of those cases that sticks with you, not just because of what happened, but because of how everything unfolded afterward. So if you need to step away at any point, that's completely okay. Listener discretion is strongly advised. This show opening is brought to you by Namaste Wellness and Aesthetics. Visit Namaste for all of your skincare, weight loss, and primary care needs. The awesome ladies at Namaste are located at 159 Omni Drive, right here in McMinnville. All right, let's go to East Tennessee. Early 1990s. It's the kind of place where you've got tourists pouring into Pigeon Forge during the day, families visiting attractions, traffic backed up on the main roads, and then just a few miles away, everything gets quiet again. Dark roads, tree lines, pockets of isolation. And it's in those spaces, the ones that people don't really think about, that this story starts to take shape. Because in 1992, women started disappearing. Not in a way that immediately sets off alarms across the state, and not the kind of cases that dominate headlines overnight. You see, these women were living on the edges of society. Some were involved in sex work. Some were just trying to get by however they could. And because of that, their disappearances didn't always get the urgency that they deserved. But eventually they were found. And when they were, there was no question that something very violent had happened. Now, what makes this case so unsettling isn't just the crimes themselves, it's what came after. Because the man at the center of this story didn't just get suspected, he confessed multiple times. And still, he was never convicted of these murders. His name was Thomas D. Husky. But if you talk to people back then, especially the women who crossed paths with him, they knew him by a different name. This is the case of the Zoo Man. They say the South never forgets, and Tennessee, she remembers everything. Welcome to Tennessee True Crime, where the shadows of the volunteer state's past meet the stories that refuse to be forgotten. I'm your host, Tiffany Morgan. Each week, we dig into twisted tales of betrayal, violence, and mystery. The ones where whispers carry truth, and the answers are never as simple as they seem. Let's step into the dark and piece together the clues. Because in Tennessee, some secrets still haunt the hills. This is Tennessee True Crime.
Down through the smoky hollers where the cold wind sighs, footsteps fall where the moonlight hides, whispers over rivers, a secret lost in time. Welcome to Tennessee True Crime.
So let's get right into it and talk about Thomas D. Husky for a minute, because understanding who Thomas Husky was, or at least who he claimed to be, really matters in this case. He grew up in East Tennessee, born to Frank D. Husky and Jessie Quarles, and by most accounts, there really isn't a ton of widely publicized information about his early childhood. You know, in cases like this, you usually see headlines that, something's not right, he's had bouts of violence before, but there was no clear moment where anyone said that. And honestly, it's not that unusual. Because a lot of times when we look back on cases like this, we want there to be obvious warning signs, something that explains away everything neatly. But real life usually isn't that clean. What we do know starts to come into focus later, especially once Thomas Husky is being evaluated and questioned. Because at some point, he begins making a very specific claim. You see, he says that there's another personality inside him, another version of himself, and he gives that personality a name, Kyle. Now, when you hear something like that, or when I hear something like that, right, I'm thinking, is this real? Is this a mental health condition? Is it something being exaggerated or something completely made up to completely avoid responsibility? And the truth is, even the courts had to wrestle with that this time. Because claims of dissociation, especially something like what used to be called multiple personality disorder, well, that complicates everything. They don't automatically mean that someone isn't responsible for what they've done, but they do create this gray area that defense attorneys can, and often do, lean into. And here's where it gets interesting. Even though Thomas D. Husky talks about Kyle as if he were a separate person, the courts ultimately didn't accept that as a defense. They didn't say, okay, well, this other personality is to blame. Instead, they treated it more like a factor rather than an excuse, which basically means whether Kyle existed or not, Thomas D. Husky was still legally responsible for anything that happened. But long before any of that played out in court, Husky was living a very different kind of life. During the day, Husky worked at the Knoxville Zoo. More specifically, he worked with elephants. And if you can just stop there for a second, it almost sounds peaceful, right? It's physical work, sure, but it's routine and it's structured. You're taking care of one of the most amazing animals, following a schedule, and doing a job that most people would find pretty doggone interesting. But the problem is, that was only one side of his life. Because when he left work, things started to shift. He began spending time in areas known for prostitution. And again, at first glance, that might not seem all that unusual. Is it deviant? Yes, but not all that unusual as you would think. But what was unusual was the way that those women started reacting to him, especially the women he had encountered before. They noticed something, and not in a subtle way. He wasn't just another client passing through. He was rough and aggressive and unpredictable. And over time, those encounters started getting worse. We're talking about situations where control really became the focus, where violence wasn't just some possibility that it could happen, it was absolutely part of his interactions. And in communities like that, word travels fast. So these women started warning each other, quietly at first, and then more openly. They didn't care who knew what was going on. Don't get in the car with him. Stay away from that guy. And eventually, he got a nickname, the Zoo Man. And that nickname wasn't just about his job, it was about his behavior. Because by that point, this had already started to escalate beyond what anyone could control. The women relayed that Zoo Man would not only take them behind the zoo for their encounters, but eventually began also tying them up, beating them, and raping them. Now, eventually, one of these women was brave enough to speak out and went to the police to describe this area, which was loosely some makeshift campsite where apparently lots of men took their prostitutes for their encounters. So when police arrived to that campsite, what did they find? Well, not only did they find the area, but they find Thomas D. Husky there with a woman. She was tied up on her knees, and police were watching Thomas D. Husky raping and beating the woman right there with their own eyes. So, of course, Thomas D. Husky was arrested, but when it came down to it, he was released and all charges were dropped. You see, these women, again, were prostitutes. And if they followed through with the charges, they would also incriminate themselves in a crime. So rather than worry about the crazy, abusive dude who was beating and tying up women, they're made to worry about their means of income at the time. And listen, I get it, right? We have to worry about all crime, but sometimes we need to prioritize before a domino death effect happens because we're worried about the wrong things. So let's fast forward to 1992, because this is where everything shifts from just disturbing to absolutely undeniable. After being caught with the woman in the woods, Thomas D. Husky, he made his mind up. He's not going to stop doing what he's doing. He's going to adapt. So he didn't want to get busted again. So he told himself right then and there that he would just get rid of the problem after he was finished with them. So in October, authorities discovered a body in a wooded area in Knox County. And then another. And then another. Until there are 4 women, all found in similar conditions, all victims of extreme violence, all victims of Knoxville's first serial killer. And before we go deeper into the investigation, I want to slow down for just a second, because it's really easy in cases like these to get caught up in the details, the suspect, the evidence, the courtroom drama. But at the center of this is 4 women who lost their lives. Women who were navigating difficult circumstances, yes, but who still mattered, whose stories did not deserve to end like this. And here's something else to consider. Knox County in the early 90s wasn't equipped the way we are today when it comes to tracking missing persons, especially adults living on the margins. There was no social media. There were no rapid alert systems, no centralized databases like we think of now. So when someone like Patricia and the others went missing, it didn't always trigger a kind of immediate, widespread response like it would today. But that does not mean that they were not missed. It just means the system did not move fast enough to reflect that. So before we move any further, I want to stop for a minute and talk about the women at the center of the case. Patricia Rose Anderson. She was the first one found in October of 1992. And in a lot of ways, that's where cases like this begin, right? When someone is discovered and suddenly everything shifts from concern to something much more real. But here's the thing. When you look into Patricia's story, you don't find pages and pages about who she was. You don't find a full picture of her life, her personality, the things she loved, the people who loved her. What you find is mostly what happened to her. And that's a pattern we're going to see again. What we do know is that Patricia had been missing for about a week before she was found. And one detail that's very hard to ignore is that she was pregnant at the time. So when we talk about Patricia, we're not just talking about one life that was lost. There were 2. And somewhere out there were people who knew her, people who noticed that she was gone, people who didn't get answers the way that they should have. And as we go through this story, I want you to hold on to that, because Patricia is not just the first victim in a timeline. She was a person. Another name that comes up in this case is Patricia Ann Johnson. And this is where things start to feel uncomfortable in a different way, because when you try to learn about her, really learn about her, you run into the same problem. There isn't much there. No detailed background, no clear picture of her life before all of this, just her name and the fact that she was found in the same wooded area. And I think it's important to say this part out loud. The absence of information does not mean that her life mattered any less. It just means that her story wasn't preserved the way that it should have been. From what's been reported, Patricia Ann Johnson was part of the same vulnerable community as the other victims. She was living in circumstances that made her an easier target. And that's something that predators look for. Not randomness, but vulnerability. So when we say her name, we're doing something that didn't happen enough at the time. We're acknowledging that she was here. She existed. That she mattered. Then there's Darlene Smith. And her name is often listed alongside the others, but again, the details are scarce. We know that she was one of the 4 women found. We know that she ended up in that very same place. And beyond that, there's very little, again, publicly known about who she was as a person. And at some point, you have to stop and ask why that is. Why do some victims get full stories told about them, while others are reduced to simply a few lines in a report? In cases like this, it often comes down to circumstances, really. Who they were, how they lived, whether society at the time chose to pay attention. But Darlene Smith was more than a circumstance. She also had a life before this happened to her, even if we don't have every detail of it. And I think it's important that we say her name with that in mind. And finally, there's Susan East Stone. Now, like the others, Susan was found in that same area, part of the same pattern, part of the same case that even now doesn't have the kind of closure that you would expect. And just like the others, when you go looking for who she is beyond this moment, you don't find much. And that is so hard, because it means for a lot of people hearing this story, this might be the first time they have ever heard these women's names. So just think about them when we're going through this story, because remembering someone, even in a small way, is better than letting them disappear completely. When you step back and look at all 4 of these women together, there's something that becomes really clear. We know more about the man accused of killing them than we do about them. And unfortunately, cases involving victims on the margins don't always get handled the same way. Not with the same urgency, not with the same pressure involved. And whether or not that played a role here, it's something a lot of people still question. When you look at all 4 of these women together, there's a broader context that starts to come into focus. Early 1990s East Tennessee, particularly in areas around Knoxville, they had pockets where sex work and transient living conditions were more visible. And law enforcement at the time, like in many parts of the country, didn't always prioritize those types of communities in the same way. Not necessarily out of indifference, really, but because of limited resources and different policing practices and a lack of systems that we have in place today. But the result is the same. It creates an environment where someone like Thomas D. Husky can operate long enough to establish a pattern. And that's the part that's hard to ignore. We know his name, we know his job, his psychological claims, his court case, but for them, only fragments. And that imbalance says a lot, not just about this case, but how cases like this are handled. So, as we move on to the rest of this story, the investigation, the trial, everything that followed, I don't want those women to fade into the background, because at the center of it all, this is their story too. And when you step back, this case isn't just about one man. It's about vulnerability and opportunity and a system that didn't fully connect the dots until it was too late. And at the center of all of it are 4 women whose stories we're still trying to piece together. And as investigators start putting their pieces together, they begin noticing patterns. The location, the victims, the level of violence involved. And once you start seeing patterns like that, it became pretty clear. This was not random. This was someone repeating the same behaviors over and over. Someone who felt way too comfortable enough to just keep it going. But eventually, that leads them to Thomas D. Huskey. Now, at that point, everything should have been lining up, right? They had a suspect, they had a pattern, they were getting so close to answers. But what happens next? Oh, it's so frustrating. It's where this case starts falling apart. So, at this point, investigators have Thomas Huskey on their radar. They bring him in for questioning. And this is the moment where everything could have gone right. Or, as it turns out, very, very wrong. Now, if you've ever watched any kind of true crime show, you've probably heard the phrase, "he invoked his rights." And it can sound like legal jargon, sure, but it's actually really very simple. It means a person says, "I don't want to talk. I want my lawyer." And once that happens, law enforcement is supposed to stop questioning them. Not slow down, not try again later, not keep prodding because we're almost there. Stop. And Huskey does exactly that. At some point during questioning, he makes it clear, "I'm done talking. I want my attorney." And that should have been the end of it, guys. At least for that moment. Get him his attorney, talk to him later. But that's not what happened. Instead of completely backing off, investigators continue reaching out to him. Not just once, multiple times, over multiple days. And this is where things start getting legally dangerous, because there's a very specific standard here. Courts call it scrupulously honoring a suspect's rights. In other words, you don't get to push. You don't get to circle back and try again because you think you're so close. And I want to pause here for a second because this is important, okay? This is not about whether Thomas D. Huskey was guilty or innocent. This is about procedure. Because the justice system is built on the idea that even if someone did commit a crime, you still have to follow the rules when you investigate it. And in this case, those rules were not followed. Now, eventually, after all this back and forth, Thomas D. Huskey starts talking again. And when he does, he doesn't just deny everything, he confesses. He gives statements across several days. He talks about the women. He talks about the violence. He talks about exactly what happened. But there's something layered in those confessions that make them different. Something that keeps coming up again and again. Kyle. He describes it like this: there are moments when I'm present, and then there's moments where Kyle takes over. moments that he claims he can't fully control. Think it can't get crazier than that? Meet Philip Dax. So when Kyle is trying to hurt Thomas D. Husky by committing these crimes, Philip Dax, who is a British aristocrat, well, he steps in to try to stop him. Philip Dax has a very fancy vocabulary. It's just mind-boggling to me. So if you're listening to that, you're thinking one of two things, okay? Either this is someone, again, trying to distance themselves from what they've done because they're guilty of sin and they're trying to pull out all the stops, or this is someone who genuinely believes what they're saying. And the truth is that the courts had to consider both of those possibilities. Now, here's where things start to unravel, because those confessions, as detailed as they were, as significant as they were, they came after his rights had already been violated, which means legally they're tainted. And when a confession is considered tainted, it cannot be used in court. Now, think about that for a second. The single most powerful piece in a court case, the entire case, gone. Not because it didn't happen, but because of how it happened. And that wasn't the only problem, right? So while all of this is happening, investigators are also building their case in another way. They obtain a search warrant. They go into Thomas D. Husky's home. Great. They collect evidence. Wonderful. Now, in most cases, that's exactly what you want, because there are some cases where there's no evidence. So you want that physical evidence to back up all these statements. You want something to say, okay, this connects him to the crime without a doubt. But once again, there's an issue. The warrant was not properly executed. There were missing details and procedural errors and things that might sound small, but legally they are not small. And I know this can be frustrating to hear because it feels like technicalities, but they're not really technicalities. You see, they're safeguards. There are things put in place to prevent the abuse of power. And the problem is, when those safeguards aren't followed, it doesn't just weaken a case, it will absolutely annihilate it. And that's exactly what starts happening here. Because once the court looks at that warrant and says, it's not valid, then everything that came from it becomes questionable. So now you've got a confession that can't be used, evidence that may not be admissible. It's fruit of the poisonous tree. And suddenly, a case that looked incredibly strong, confession and evidence, it's hanging by a thread. So when this finally goes to trial, there's a lot riding on it. The prosecution is trying to hold together what's left of their case. The defense is focused on one thing: how that evidence was obtained. And that becomes the battleground of this case. Not necessarily what happened, but whether the state can legally prove it. Now, after everything is presented, after all the arguments, the jury cannot reach a decision. It's a hung jury. No conviction. None. No acquittal, just uncertainty. And from there, the case doesn't get stronger, it gets weaker. So, as the appeals process plays out, the earlier issues come back front and center. And the courts confirm that Thomas D. Husky's rights were violated, the confession should not have been admitted, and the search was flawed. And once those pieces fall away, there is not enough left to proceed. So eventually, the murder charges are dismissed. A man confessed to killing 4 women and was never convicted of those murders. Now, that doesn't mean that Thomas D. Husky walked free, because he didn't. There were other charges, separate cases, and in those, there was enough evidence. He was convicted of aggravated rape, kidnapping of 4 other women. Violent crimes that on their own are very incredibly serious. He was sentenced to decades in prison, 66 years. So he didn't escape accountability entirely, but when it comes to the murders, there was never a conviction. And that distinction matters because when you step back and take a look at this case as a whole, it leaves you with a really very uncomfortable question. What matters more? Knowing what happened or being able to prove it the right way? Because in this case, those 2 things didn't line up. The system didn't say that the murders didn't happen. It didn't say that there wasn't a suspect. It said the case was not built correctly. And because of that, it couldn't hold. And that leaves us right here. 4 women whose lives were taken. A man who admitted to all of it. And a legal system that, for all its structures and safeguards, could not bring those 2 things together in a way that could lead to a conviction. And sometimes that's the part that stays with you. Not what we know, but what we can never officially approve. And when you really think about this case, it doesn't feel finished. It just stops. Because everything was there. There were victims, there was a pattern, there was a suspect, there were confessions, there was evidence, but none of it came together the way it was supposed to. And that's what makes this so unsettling. Not just what happened, but how close it came to being proven and giving those families justice. Because somewhere in those interrogation rooms, the truth surfaced. And then a line was crossed. A rule wasn't followed. A right wasn't honored. And from that moment on, everything started falling apart. Because in the end, it didn't matter what was said. It mattered how it was obtained. And because of that, the confession couldn't be used, the evidence didn't hold, and the case collapsed. So now we're left with this. Patricia Rose Anderson, Patricia Ann Johnson, Darlene Smith, and Susan East Stone. 4 names, 5 lives when you remember that sweet unborn baby, and no murder conviction. A man confessed and was never held legally responsible for those killings. Not because the story didn't make sense, not because there wasn't a suspect, but because the system was not followed the way that it needed to be. And that leaves something behind, a gap between what we know and what was never proven. And in that gap, the questions don't go away. They stay and they echo. The families hold on to this because the truth does not disappear. They know exactly who took their loved ones. Sometimes it just never makes it onto the record. This episode, Confessions of the Zoo Man, was written and hosted by me, Tiffany Morgan, and produced by Christian Weeder at Main Street Media. Background music and theme song by John T. Productions. Research support from Court Archives, WBIR.com, and Murderpedia.org. This finale was brought to you by the wonderful folks at Jones & Co. Real Estate. If you are buying or selling a home, come visit us at 304 Mulliken Street or give us a call at 931-474-2020. There is a wonderful team of qualified and friendly realtors ready to help you. And if you would like to sponsor an episode, we would love to partner with you. Our sponsors keep our shows funded and running. To support Tennessee True Crime, follow us on Facebook at Tennessee True Crime and Instagram at TN True Crime. You can find case and evidence photos on those socials. We are also now on Spotify and most other streaming platforms, so give us a follow and please leave a rating after you listen. If you have a case that you're interested in me covering, please feel free to email me at tntruecrime@mainstreetmedia.llc or reach out to me on any of those social media platforms. I have started having people reach out to me, and whether it's to request case coverage or give feedback or just to introduce yourselves and tell me that you're a listener, I love it. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to talk with each and every one of you. Join me next week as we uncover another Tennessee case that has left a lasting mark. Because here in Tennessee, we never stop telling the stories that matter. And some secrets we refuse to let stay buried. Tune in next time on Tennessee True Crime.
Down through the smoky hollers where the cold wind sighs, footsteps fall where the moonlight hides, whispers over rivers, a secret lost in time. Welcome to Tennessee True Crime. Dark tales in the mountains where the mist won't lie, echoes of the fallen under starless skies. Hear the hush of memory, the voice of the unsaid. This is Tennessee True Crime, where the shadows tread.